Nick gave a good talk to start off this morning because he went through and talked about who our main customers are for our exported wheat. And also he talked about basically what impacts our prices. Basically it's supply and demand. And as he said, wheat actually prices react very quickly to the levels of stocks to use ratios. And yeah, thanks, Jamie. And also prices will spike, as you can see here, and as you can see there, and can come back again very quickly. And so I'm going to quickly skip these slides because he covered that area very nicely. But the key thing to remember is that wheat prices basically are going to be a response to global supply. And the other thing to remember is that while he said we're a very small producer in the world, and that's very important, we're a major exporter, but right at the very end I'm going to show you a slide that overall production for Australia is a problem. We can't grow the large volumes of wheat we need to generate the revenue to be able to counter some of the high volatility which we see with wheat prices. So I was asked to talk about what is it that our customers really want from our grain. So basically, if you're a flour miller, you're going to buy wheat, and you want wheat that has a high flour yield, and you want it to make good food, bread or noodles or whatever it might be. If you're an oilseed crusher, you want oilseeds that will give you high oil yield, but also a high milk protein content. And if you're a maltster, you want barley that'll malt evenly and produce a high quality malt that will produce the right type of product for beer or whatever the product might be. It could be a sachet or something like that. The key thing is that it's the market signals which we see as receivable standards that really give you as producers the key information in terms of responding to what our customers want. So we get paid more for protein. The higher the protein, the higher the price usually, and last year we saw quite a substantial premium for high protein, prime hard wheat. We get penalised if we don't have low moisture, if it's higher than our receivable standard level. We have to achieve a certain test weight, and they certainly don't want any sprouting or germination or weather damage, and I'll look at that a bit more. They don't want any screens or any foreign material, and they want good grain appearance. So these are the key things that we have to respond to in terms of producing our grain. And very importantly too is also the grade or the variety that we produce in terms of where that grain usually will go. So let's go back and look at protein, because protein is probably the easiest one to start with. In wheat we've got a particular protein called gluten, and as you can see in this picture, gluten actually forms this film, and that is unique to wheat. This protein called gluten actually has a very high, it's a very long protein. It's a big protein, if you like, and because of that, it can actually form this intricate net to actually trap the gas bubbles formed when yeast goes to work in the dough, and that allows the bread to rise. So it's the gluten in wheat that basically gives us the texture of the bread that we like. And that's why it's so hard to get a bread that's gluten-free that actually has the texture of wheat bread. Now, to make good bread, we need to have not only the amount of gluten or protein to be the right level, but we also need to have the right quality. So different varieties will have different quality of this gluten. And we measure that through extensibility. So when we make a dough, how far can we stretch it? We measure it in the strength, so that when we make a dough, how much energy do we have to use in mixing that dough? Does it need a lot of energy input from the mixer or not much at all? Because that will determine basically how well the dough can hold its shape when it rises, when we put it in the oven for the baking process. And down here you can just see, here's an example of a small loaf of bread, and that's a soft wheat, in this case Sunsoft, Jance, which is a hard wheat, and sun-dried, which in that case has actually performed very well. And this is just a better example of showing the importance of protein content in low volume. And it's very well known that generally the higher the level of protein in your dough when you're making bread, the higher the loaf will rise and the greater the volume. And so this is usually much more desirable over this, not only because it's bigger, I mean the actual weight of the dough, the amount of flour and water will be exactly the same, but it's because it actually is more appealing, because the texture here will be softer than here, just because there's more smaller bubbles, finer bubbles that make that crumb of the bread a lot softer. Now, how many of you make bread? A few of you? Yeah. Do you make it from scratch? Do you buy your own flour, or do you buy premixes? Premixes, yeah. The premixes these days are very good, and it's pretty hard to get it wrong. If you follow the instructions, they work really well, and you get a very good loaf of bread out of them. And that's because they're using the right type of wheat, but they're also adding lots of other things in there too to help us get it right. It's actually quite hard to get a loaf of bread out of starting from scratch. If you took your wheat, you milled it, and you added yeast, and you added a bit of sugar, a bit of salt, water, most of the time you'd probably struggle to get the same quality loaf out of your wheat as what those premixes provide. So they've been tested and tried, and they work pretty well. Now, low moisture is important, and the reason for that is when we have lots of moisture, we get lots of insects. And these grain storage insects really like moisture, and they like warmth. So that's why when we send our wheat to the silo, they measure moisture. If we're over 12.5%, they don't like it. So the importance of having dry wheat is really to ensure that we can safely store it until at least the next harvest. So we've got to make sure that we keep the wheat dry to minimise the activity of these insects. Test weight's important as well, and this is where we measure the bulk density. And I know there's a couple of people here that are aware that there's a push to increase our minimum test weight standard from where it is now at 74 to about 76. And you might think, oh well, is that going to have much impact on me? It may not, but in some places of Australia, in some varieties, that will have an impact, because some varieties don't have a naturally high test weight, and in some years they will struggle to achieve that 76. So why is test weight important? Anyone know? I know Wayne does, but well, test weight's important because before we had the ability to measure protein, before we had the ability to measure falling numbers, the only way we could really get an indication whether the weather or the environment had impacted our quality of our wheat was to actually measure test weight. So generally, if you've had rain on your wheat at harvest, what happens is the grain will swell, and it may dry out again and be quite dry, but it won't shrink back to the same size. So what happens is you get a slight increase in volume of your grain, your test weight will go down. You can't get as many grains in that same volume, and as a result your test weight goes down. Your total amount of wheat's still there, and people often say, I've lost weight. You haven't lost weight, you just lost density. So it'll mean that you'll probably need a couple of extra truckloads to get all your wheat down to the silo because it's taking up more space. So that was an indication for the millers. They saw low test weights. They said, oh, I'm a bit worried about this. This grain may have had some weathering on it, may have had some rain damage. I've got to be wary because it may cause problems with the flour quality. So that's really what test weight's there for now. And generally, if you have a test weight of 74 or over, you can almost always rule out the effect of weather on that grain. So it's a historical measure we've had, test weight. It was one of the earliest measures we had in terms of checking what the quality of the grain was and whether there'd been an impact from weather. So there's really no need to make that any higher than what it currently has been, and has been for a long time. Because the flour millers know that at 74, the wheat will generally be fine, and they've got falling number tests to check for whether there's been any sprouting. But apart from that, the wheat itself should perform well in the mill. So test weight's important as well. And of course, The better the plants are, then the bigger the grain, but it doesn't reflect on grain size. In fact, you can sometimes get very large grain that'll have a low test weight, because remember, it's about density and it's the way the grains will pack into a fixed volume. So you can have very small grain that can actually have a high test weight. Just because of the way it packs, you get more grains in there, there's more weight in that fixed volume, you have a high test weight result. So in terms of flour yield, people often think flour yield is something you can determine from test weight, but not really. You get a better correlation from grain size and grain weight rather than test weight per se. So now we come to the interesting one, and we're going to look at the falling number. Thanks to Marie and Tony for your assistance there, and also the James. We don't have to finish yet though, because we've still got to find out what happens to these two containers on the table. So that's really what this falling number test is all about. It's measuring the impact of rain on our wheat. But if we were to mill low falling number wheat, what we would see is we would get, in our flatbreads, basically a very dark product. That's because the sugars are caramelising when we bake them. In the case of bread, when we go, it can probably bake all right, we'll go through the slicer, but once we go to slice it, because it doesn't set, it actually sticks to the slicing blades and just rips apart, pulls apart. So, and of course that thing there will pull a plant bakery to a halt. And they hate that because it's a messy job, they've got to clean it up. And that's why they just will do anything they can to avoid low falling number wheat. In the case of noodles, we get discoloration because there are these enzymes that are produced which cause discoloration, a darkening colour to be produced, and also we get breakdown of other products too that cause darker colour. And in the case of these Chinese steam breads, you can see that the steam bread just doesn't hold its nice dome shape as well, and it gets a bit dimply on it as well, and it tends to spread out a lot more. So it goes right through to our end products. So that's why having weather damage is a real problem for our food manufacturers. Now that's the actual machine that does the falling number test. Essentially, it's doing something very similar to what Marie and Tony just did. It's essentially making a wheat meal porridge, if you like, and then we're just measuring the time for a rod to fall down through that, as opposed to just stirring it like we would with the cups over here or with our saucepans at home. And what we do is we measure how long that rod takes to fall through. The first 60 seconds are involved in just mixing. So you won't get a falling number less than 60 seconds. If you do, something wrong with the machine. But you can get a 62 or 61 or 63, and that basically is just syrup, just water. There's been no thickening at all. So there's a little water bath in there. That's essentially the hot water that we added to our meal, and it mixes for 60 seconds, and then we measure how long it takes for it to drop down. Now this is a lengthy process, and it's something which everyone hates going through, not only because you know you're going to be downgraded, but it's the time it takes at receival. So some years ago we looked at, could we actually develop something that would actually pick up that there was weather damage, so that you could quickly get rid of your truckload, you could at least segregate it, but you'd have much quicker throughput in the silo. So one of the things that we looked at was a simple machine that actually would measure basically the squeezability, if you like, of grain. And you think, well, what would that do? How does that measure falling number? Because you're not actually making anything out of it. Well, it works because what we found was that when you start to get germination occurring in the grain, and you start to get breakdown of your starch to sugars, the density of the grain itself changes. And you find that you can actually get good separation, or fairly good separation, in terms of high falling number and low falling number. And so that's like a drafting gun. So the idea is you don't actually get a falling number out of it, but you know whether it's sound, therefore can be segregated, or whether it's actually low. And these are falling number tests, but at least you know it needs a falling number test and you can segregate it straight away. We also found that with falling number, when we baked the samples, we also got a pretty good correlation as well. So a low falling number gave a low loaf score, and a high falling number gave a good loaf score. And we had correlation with the values that we developed from this instrument. There is, however, another thing that can happen, and often we don't see it at all because we don't even know it's there. And that is when you actually get sprouting occurring, well not sprouting, but you actually get the same effect of germination when there has been no rain. And this is when we have, it doesn't happen very often, but this is when we have the right conditions for certain varieties to actually trigger the enzyme which causes the starch to be converted to sugar. That occurs when, in fact, there has been no rain. So we deliver the wheat, it looks fine, and we find that later on, down the track, the customer comes back and does a falling number and they say, this has got a low falling number. We go, well, it can't have, it hasn't rained. But there is this thing called late maturity alpha amylase, and it's a genetic defect, and it's where, when we get the right type of temperatures, and so and this is during a critical time after flowering. It's about a month after flowering. We can get low temperatures for about 3 or 4 days, and that will turn this enzyme on and result in low pollen numbers. And it was actually found to be quite common in some of the germplasm that came in through the simid. And as I said, usually not detected at receival. So it ends up being a problem further down the track. It can cause a huge problem if a whole shipload has been delivered and low pollen numbers have been detected. So there is a process with our breeding programs to actually look at identifying this genetic defect at the very beginning and trying to ensure that those varieties actually don't get released. Now, how many of you have grown Kennedy or heard of Kennedy? Now, you might be aware that Kennedy actually is only prime hard up in Queensland and it's not in New South Wales because it has this genetic defect. It's got this late maturity alpha amylase.
Originally was prime hard.
It was originally prime hard, yeah. Originally prime hard because when it was released, no one knew it had this genetic defect. It ended up being downgraded as a result of identifying that this was a problem for it. So it has happened in the past, and people, breeders, are a lot more vigilant now about ensuring that those varieties aren't released. Screenings are also important when we deliver grain, particularly cereals. And usually it comes from when we have either small, well-formed grain or just pinched grain. And usually results in less flour for the flour millers. And in terms of barley, it would result in uneven germination. But probably the key thing really is for the flour millers is that if you have smaller grain, you end up with a greater proportion of bran to the endosperm, to what's inside the grain. And so after milling, you end up with a higher bran contamination, simply because there's more of it there. So flour millers will always prefer to have large grain than small grain, even if that wheat's giving them the same flour yield, because they know they'll end up with a higher bran contamination with a small grain at the end. And that causes problems then for some of the products in terms of colour, and also in terms of potentially with bread, in terms of the volume of the bread, because that thin film of gluten that you could see on the hand in that previous picture is like a balloon holding the gas. And if you've got bran there, they're like little pins, and they put little holes through that gluten so the gas escapes and the bread doesn't rise as much.
Those things over there are pretty full.
Thank you. Yes, they're pretty full. Problem is there's a race on and I reckon it's dead heat at the moment. I can't tell them apart at this stage. Which one will go to the top first, do you think? What do you reckon, James? I can't tell them apart. What I'll do to save a mess. I'll put them there. As soon as you see one go over the top, let me know. And grain appearance is important as well, because we can have either the effect of weather, so in this case we've had frost on this wheat here, or we can have black point, or we can have a whole range of things like some pink staining, some black point, some field fungi there as well, or we can have a disease, in this case it's white grain disorder, which was fairly common in, or not, has been present in parts of South Australia the last couple of harvests as well. So the issue around grain appearance is, okay, it doesn't look so good, but it's really more, it's an indication. And again, it's like test weight. If it looks bad, there's a chance it may be bad. And this is bad from a food safety point of view. So if you have pink grain, that could indicate there's a fusarium infection, and that can result in mycotoxins. So basically, a real food safety issue. So even from a feeding point of view, so feeding animals, pink grain is highly undesirable. Black point, on the other hand, though, is totally different. Black point looks bad, and you usually find it down at the germ end. And the reason it's there is because it's a response to often a wet harvest or a wet year. And when you eat an apple or a piece of fruit, you leave it on the bench, you often find that it'll go brown. And that's because it's a natural oxidation process that actually stops that apple from going mouldy. So you often find a half-eaten apple in the back of the car, and it'll be brown and shriveled, but it won't be mouldy. And that's because this browning here is caused by compounds which actually protect that germ from being infected by fungi. So the issue there is really, is it a food safety issue or not? In the case of some of these visual defects, because it's done subjectively at receival, you've got someone sitting there and looking at it and saying, well, what is it, what isn't it? We also did some work looking at, can we use imaging systems to identify what these particular stains are? And in fact, what we found is yes, you can. So you can get an imaging system to identify pink as pink staining, potentially fusarium, brown as black point, and the greys as field fungi. But not only do that, it actually will give you a total area of the grain affected. And that's often the hardest thing. It's not identifying what's there, it's identifying how much of the grain's being affected. So as I mentioned, grade and variety are important as well. 2 loaves of bread, which one would you buy? Which one?
The left.
The left, yep. Most people buy the left. Anyone buy the right?
Yeah, I probably would.
Yeah? Yep. Well, that just blew my theory out of the water, but generally what you find is that most people would buy this one, and that's the one made from hard wheat. This is made from biscuit wheat. So you might notice that the crust is not as shiny here as it is here, and the volume's not quite as much. And you notice it's not quite the same colour on the side as this one. So that's just showing that the difference in actual variety is important in terms of the most appealing product. Now I'll skip over that, but this just quickly shows that, of course, the higher the grade, the higher the protein content, the better the bacon score. So basically, trying to achieve those grade levels, it is a protein issue, but actually selecting the right variety to start with will always set you up for the best potential end use for that particular product. So you're going to the top. Which one? The left one. Thank you. Actually, there's a good difference there now. That's a good difference. That's good. It's happened just in the nick of time. And I'm going to finish on this slide. Now, I mentioned earlier that for Australia, so here's Australia, this is our blue line down here. So these are yields from the 60s up to almost now. Australia hasn't had the rise in yield like some of these other countries like China and, in this case, Europe. We've been bobbing along down here. So if we know prices are going to be volatile, they're going to go up and down, and we just can't achieve high levels of production from our land, Australia as a wheat producer, we have to seek the premium markets, or the markets that are going to appreciate quality, because we can't produce the volume to get the returns. So, and it frustrates me in many ways that it's really hard to get markets to pay premiums, but I think it's an education process, and it's an education process that I think that it starts with you as the producers, so that when you're talking to your marketers and to your customers, you know what you've got, and you've got a feel for what the value of that is. And then that value hopefully will get translated along the chain. And I think that we've had a long period of time in the industry where I think people have been able to probably take advantage of being able to source very good wheat for not much more money than what they probably paid for not so good wheat.